The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty outskirts of Tombstone in the summer of 1886. Eli Mercer adjusted his weathered hat and guided his horse Thunder along the forgotten trail that led to the abandoned Copper Creek mine. Known throughout the territory as the Cowboy Loner, Eli had earned his reputation through years of solitary wandering, taking odd jobs and avoiding the complications that came with staying in one place too long. Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now. At 43, Eli's face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. His steel-gray eyes held secrets of their own, and the twin Colt revolvers at his hips had settled more disputes than he cared to remember. Today, he was tracking a stolen horse for Sheriff Morrison, a simple job that should have been finished by noon. But as Thunder's hooves crunched over the dried creek bed, an unusual sound caught Eli's attention. It was faint, almost lost in the desert wind, but unmistakably human, a soft whimpering that made his blood run cold. "Easy, boy," Eli whispered to Thunder, dismounting with practiced silence. He followed the sound through a cluster of weathered rocks and stunted Joshua trees until he reached the old well that had served the mine workers decades ago. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his days. A boy, no more than 10 years old, sat chained to the crumbling stone rim of the well. His clothes were torn and filthy, his dark hair matted with dirt and dried blood. Heavy iron shackles bound his thin wrists, connected by a chain that had been secured to an iron ring embedded in the well's stonework. The child's eyes, wide and terrified, met Eli's, but no sound escaped his lips. "Jesus Christ," Eli breathed, his hand instinctively moving to his gun before he realized there was no immediate threat to fight. He approached slowly, his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "Hey there, son. I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Eli." The boy shrank back as far as the chains would allow, his eyes darting between Eli and the surrounding desert, as if expecting someone to emerge from the rocks at any moment. Eli knelt beside the well, examining the shackles. They were old but sturdy, and the lock would require either a key or his tools back at Thunder's saddlebags. "Who did this to you, boy? Where are your folks?" The child's mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, he began to shake his head frantically, pointing toward the horizon with desperate urgency. "Someone's coming?" Eli asked, following the boy's gaze. In the distance, a dust cloud was rising. Riders, and they were heading this way fast. Without hesitation, Eli drew his knife and began working at the chain's weakest link. The metal was old and corroded, but it would take time he didn't have. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. "Listen to me," Eli said firmly, his voice cutting through the boy's panic. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay calm. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. The chain finally gave way with a sharp crack. Eli scooped the boy into his arms, feeling how light and fragile he was beneath the torn clothes. "Hold on tight," he whispered, carrying the child to where Thunder waited. As they reached the horse, Eli could make out 3 riders cresting the ridge, men in dark clothing with rifles across their saddles. Their faces were hard, their intentions clear. "Up you go," Eli said, lifting the boy onto Thunder's back before swinging up behind him. "We're gonna ride hard, son. Don't let go." Thunder responded to Eli's spurs with explosive power, launching into a full gallop across the desert floor. Behind them, shouts erupted as the riders spotted their escape. The crack of rifle fire split the air, bullets whining past their heads. Eli guided Thunder through a maze of rocks and arroyos, using every trick he'd learned in 20 years of frontier life. The boy clung to the saddle horn, his small body pressed against Eli's chest as they raced toward the safety of Tombstone. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Eli finally slowed Thunder to a walk. They had lost their pursuers in the broken terrain, but he knew it was only temporary. Men who would chain a child to a well wouldn't give up easily. "We're safe for now," Eli said, feeling the boy's trembling begin to subside. "What's your name, son?" The boy turned in the saddle to look at Eli, his dark eyes still wide with fear. He opened his mouth again, but instead of words, only a soft, anguished sound emerged. It was then that Eli noticed the thin scar across the boy's throat, old but unmistakable. "They hurt you," Eli said, his voice thick with anger. "They cut your voice away." The boy nodded, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. As they approached the outskirts of Tombstone, Eli's mind raced with questions. Who was this child? Why had he been chained to that well? And who were the men so desperate to reclaim him that they'd risk a gunfight in broad daylight? "We're gonna figure this out," Eli promised, guiding Thunder toward the town's main street. "I don't know who you are or what they want with you, but I swear on my mother's grave nobody's gonna hurt you again." The boy reached into his torn shirt and pulled out a small piece of charcoal, probably scavenged from an old campfire. With shaking hands, he began to draw on the leather of the saddle, rough lines and symbols that meant nothing to Eli but seemed desperately important to the child. As they rode into Tombstone, the boy continued his frantic drawing, creating what looked like a crude map. And somewhere in the back of Eli's mind, a terrible certainty began to form. This silent child held a secret that men were willing to kill for. The first chapter of their journey was ending, but Eli sensed that the real danger was just beginning. In a town where silver flowed like water and men's lives were worth less than the bullets that ended them, a mute boy with a mysterious map was about to turn Eli Mercer's solitary world upside down. As Thunder's hooves echoed off the wooden sidewalks of Tombstone's main street, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The boy's map was nearly complete now, and with each line he drew, Eli felt the weight of an invisible noose tightening around their necks. Whatever secret this child carried, it was big enough to kill for. And in the lawless territory of 1886 Arizona, that made them both walking targets in a game whose rules Eli was only beginning to understand. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the heart of Tombstone's bustling main street, its bat-wing doors constantly swinging as miners, gamblers, and drifters sought refuge from the desert heat. But Eli Mercer had no interest in whiskey or cards today. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The boy, who Eli had started calling Samuel in his mind after his own lost brother, sat huddled in a corner booth of the saloon's back room. Doc Holliday's old friend, Martha Kellerman, had agreed to let them use the space while she tended to the child's wounds. Martha was one of the few people in Tombstone who didn't ask too many questions, a quality that had served her well in a town where curiosity could get you killed. "Poor little thing," Martha murmured, gently cleaning the cuts on Samuel's wrists where the shackles had bitten deep. "Whoever did this to him ought to be strung up." Eli stood by the window, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of their pursuers. "Have you seen anything like this before, Martha? A child treated this way?" Martha's weathered face hardened. "More than I care to admit. This territory's got a dark side, Eli. Men who think they can do whatever they please to those who can't fight back." Samuel had finished his map on a piece of paper Martha had provided. The crude drawing showed what appeared to be a series of connected tunnels, with strange symbols marking specific locations. At the center of the map was a large X, surrounded by what looked like dollar signs. "What do you make of this, son?" Eli asked, sitting across from Samuel. "This map you drew, is it important?" Samuel nodded vigorously, then pointed to himself and made a gesture toward the map. His meaning was clear. He had been there, wherever there was. Martha finished bandaging Samuel's wrists and joined them at the table. "Those symbols," she said, studying the map closely. "I've seen markings like these before. They're mine markers, the kind the old prospectors used to mark their claims." Eli felt a chill run down his spine. "Which mines? Could be any of them. This whole area's riddled with old workings. But if I had to guess," Martha traced her finger along the map's main tunnel. "This looks like it could be the old Esperanza mine." It was abandoned after the cave-in of '82. The Esperanza, Eli repeated. He'd heard stories about that place, how a dozen men had died when the main shaft collapsed, and how the mine's owner, a man named Vincent Blackwood, had disappeared shortly after. I thought that place was sealed up. Officially, yes. But there's always been rumors about Blackwood hiding something down there before he vanished. Silver, maybe, or... Martha's voice trailed off as she noticed Samuel's reaction to Blackwood's name. The boy had gone rigid, his eyes wide with terror. "You know that name, don't you?" Eli said gently. "Vincent Blackwood. He's the one who hurt you." Samuel nodded, then began making frantic gestures. He pointed to the map, then to his throat, then made a cutting motion across his neck. "Blackwood cut your voice," Eli said, his anger building. "And he kept you prisoner in those mines." The saloon's front door slammed open, and Sheriff Morrison's heavy boots echoed across the wooden floor. "Eli, you in here?" "Back here, Sheriff," Eli called, quickly folding Samuel's map and tucking it into his vest. Morrison appeared in the doorway, his badge gleaming in the lamplight. He was a good man, but Eli had learned long ago that even good men could be bought in a town like Tombstone. "Heard you found yourself astray," Morrison said, his eyes settling on Samuel. "Poor little fella. Any idea who he belongs to?" "Working on it," Eli replied carefully. "Someone chained him to the old well out by Copper Creek. Figured I'd bring him to town, see if anyone recognized him." Morrison's expression didn't change, but Eli caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Chained, you say? That's mighty peculiar. You see who did it? 3 riders. They took off when they saw me coming." Eli watched Morrison's face carefully. "You know anything about missing children, Sheriff?" "Can't say I do, but I'll ask around, see what I can find out." Morrison stepped closer to Samuel, who immediately shrank back against Martha. "What's wrong with him? Why won't he talk?" "Looks like someone cut his throat," Martha said bluntly. "Whoever did it wanted to make sure he'd never tell what he saw." Morrison's hand moved unconsciously to his gun belt. "That's a serious accusation, Martha." "You got any proof of that?" Before Martha could answer, the sound of approaching horses filled the street outside. Eli moved to the window and cursed under his breath. The same 3 riders from the desert were dismounting in front of the saloon, their rifles clearly visible. "Eli," Morrison said quietly, "I think you and the boy better come with me, for your own protection." The way Morrison's hand rested on his gun told Eli everything he needed to know. The sheriff wasn't offering protection. He was making an arrest. "I don't think so, Sheriff," Eli said, his own hand moving to his Colt. "The boy stays with me." "Now don't make this harder than it has to be," Morrison warned. "There's men outside who say you kidnapped that child. They got papers saying he belongs to them." "What kind of papers?" Martha demanded. "Legal guardianship, signed by a judge in Tucson." Morrison's voice was steady, but Eli could see the doubt in his eyes. "Says the boy's name is Thomas Blackwood, and he's the ward of his uncle, Vincent Blackwood." Samuel let out a strangled cry and pressed himself against Martha's side. The terror in his eyes was answer enough. "Vincent Blackwood's been missing for 4 years, Eli said. "How's he signing legal papers?" "That's not for me to decide," Morrison replied. "I just enforce the law." The saloon's front door creaked open, and heavy footsteps approached. Eli recognized the lead rider from the desert, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes. Behind him came 2 others, both armed and dangerous-looking. "Sheriff Morrison," the scarred man said, tipping his hat. "I'm Jake Brennan, representing Mr. Vincent Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to my employer." "The boy's right here," Morrison said, gesturing toward Samuel. "Though I got to say, Mr. Brennan, this whole situation seems mighty irregular." Brennan's smile was as cold as winter wind. "Mr. Blackwood's been searching for his nephew for months. The boy ran away from his guardian and has been living wild in the desert. We're just here to bring him home." "That's a lie," Eli said flatly. "I found him chained to a well. Nobody chains their own kin." "The boy's disturbed," Brennan replied smoothly. "Has been ever since his parents died. Sometimes he hurts himself, tries to run away. The restraints were for his own protection." Samuel was shaking now, his small hands clutching Martha's dress. He looked up at Eli with desperate eyes, then pointed to the map hidden in Eli's vest. "I'm not letting you take him," Eli said, stepping between Brennan and the boy. Brennan's hand moved to his gun. "I'm afraid that's not your choice to make, cowboy. The law's on our side." "Maybe so," Eli replied. "But I've got something you want more than that, boy." He pulled out Samuel's map and held it up. Brennan's eyes went wide, and for just a moment, his careful composure cracked. "That's just a child's drawing," Brennan said, but his voice betrayed his interest. "Is it?" Eli smiled grimly. "Then you won't mind if I show it to the territorial marshal. I'm sure he'd be real interested in what this disturbed boy has been drawing." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison's hand hovered over his gun, unsure which side to choose. Martha had wrapped her arms protectively around Samuel, ready to fight despite being unarmed. "Tell you what, Brennan," Eli said. "You and your boys ride out of town, and maybe this map disappears. But the boy stays with me." Brennan's scarred face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're dealing with, cowboy. That map belongs to Mr. Blackwood, and so does the boy." "Then Mr. Blackwood can come get them himself," Eli replied, "assuming he's still alive." The standoff stretched for long seconds, the only sound the ticking of the saloon's old clock. Finally, Brennan stepped back, his hand moving away from his gun. "This isn't over," he said. "Mr. Blackwood has friends in high places, legal friends." "I'm sure he does," Eli said. "But until I see Vincent Blackwood himself, the boy stays put." After Brennan and his men left, Morrison turned to Eli with troubled eyes. "You just made some powerful enemies, friend. I hope you know what you're doing." "So do I, Sheriff," Eli replied, looking down at Samuel's map. "So do I." As night fell over Tombstone, Eli studied the crude drawing by lamplight. Whatever secret lay hidden in the Esperanza mine, it was worth killing for. And somewhere in the darkness, Vincent Blackwood, dead or alive, was pulling strings that reached all the way to the territorial government. The boy called Thomas Blackwood held the key to it all, locked away in his damaged throat and his traumatized mind. But maps could be read, even by those who couldn't speak. And Eli Mercer was about to discover that some secrets were buried so deep they could shake the very foundations of the territory itself. The pre-dawn air was crisp as Eli saddled Thunder behind Martha's boarding house. Samuel, or Thomas as Eli now knew him, sat on a wooden crate, watching with alert eyes as Eli checked his weapons and supplies. The boy had slept fitfully, waking several times with silent screams that broke Eli's heart. "You sure about this, Eli?" Martha asked, handing him a canvas bag filled with food and water. "That mine's been trouble since the day it opened. I can't protect him by running," Eli replied, securing the bag to his saddle. "Whatever's in that mine, it's the reason they want the boy. If I can find it first, maybe I can use it to bargain for his safety." Samuel stood up and walked to Thunder, patting the horse's neck with surprising confidence. The boy had drawn another map during the night, this one more detailed, showing what appeared to be a hidden entrance to the Esperanza mine. "He wants to go with you," Martha observed. "Look at him." Eli studied the boy's face. Despite his obvious fear, there was determination there too, the kind of resolve that came from having nothing left to lose. "It's too dangerous," Eli said. "If something happens to me, I need to know he's safe." Samuel shook his head vigorously and pointed to the map, then to himself. He made a series of gestures that were becoming familiar to Eli, pointing to his eyes, then to the mine, then back to himself. "He's the only one who knows the way," Martha said quietly. "And maybe the only one who knows what's really down there." Eli knelt beside Samuel, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "If you come with me, you have to do exactly what I say, no matter what happens. Understand?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "Then let's go find out what Vincent Blackwood was hiding." The ride to the Esperanza mine took them through some of the most desolate country in Arizona territory. The landscape was a maze of red rock formations and deep arroyos, perfect for hiding secrets or bodies. Samuel guided them along paths that didn't appear on any map, routes that seemed to have been deliberately concealed. As they approached the mine, Eli could see why it had been abandoned so quickly after the cave-in. The main entrance was sealed with heavy timbers and warning signs, but the entire area felt wrong somehow, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Samuel led them to a cluster of rocks about a quarter-mile from the main entrance. Hidden behind a fallen boulder was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "This is it?" Eli asked. Samuel nodded and began to crawl into the opening. Eli followed, his Colt drawn and ready. The passage was tight and uncomfortable, but after about 50 feet, it opened into a natural cave that connected to the mine's tunnel system. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the metallic taste of old blood and fear. Eli lit a lantern, and the flickering light revealed rough-hewn walls supported by rotting timbers. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and the sound echoed like a funeral bell. Samuel moved with surprising confidence through the tunnels, following a route he obviously knew by heart. They passed several side passages, but the boy led them steadily deeper into the mountain's heart. "How long were you down here?" Eli whispered. Samuel held up both hands, then 3 fingers. 13 months. More than a year in this underground hell. They came to a junction where 3 tunnels met. Samuel stopped and pointed to marks carved into the wall, the same symbols from his map. But these weren't mine markers, Eli realized. They were something else entirely. "What do these mean?" he asked. Samuel pointed to one symbol, a circle with a line through it, then made a cutting gesture across his throat. Another symbol, resembling a $sign, made him point deeper into the mine. A third symbol, looking like a crude drawing of a child, made him point to himself. "A record," Eli breathed. Blackwood was keeping records down here. They followed the tunnel marked with the $sign, and after another 100 yards, they emerged into a large chamber that had been carved out of the living rock. What Eli saw there made his blood run cold. The chamber was filled with wooden crates, stacked floor to ceiling along the walls. But these weren't filled with silver or gold. Eli pried open the nearest crate and found bundles of cash, more money than he'd ever seen in one place. U.S. currency, Mexican pesos, even some foreign bills he didn't recognize. "Jesus," Eli whispered. "There's got to be hundreds of thousands of dollars here." But Samuel was pointing to something else. A desk in the corner of the chamber, covered with papers and ledgers. Eli approached it carefully, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls. The papers told a story that made Eli's stomach turn. Vincent Blackwood hadn't been just a mine owner. He'd been running a criminal empire that stretched across 3 territories. The ledgers detailed everything: stolen silver shipments, protection rackets, human trafficking, and worse. One ledger was marked Special Inventory, and when Eli opened it, he found a list of names and ages. All children, all marked as acquired or disposed of. Samuel's name, Thomas Blackwood, was at the bottom of the list, marked as witness contained. "You saw it all," Eli said, his voice thick with rage. "You saw what your uncle was doing, and he couldn't let you tell anyone." Samuel nodded, tears streaming down his face. He pointed to another section of the chamber, where Eli's lantern light revealed something that made him want to vomit. Shallow graves, marked with stones. Too many of them, too small. "He killed them," Eli said. "All those children, and you were supposed to be next." A sound echoed through the tunnels. Voices getting closer. Eli grabbed the most damning ledgers and stuffed them into his coat. "We need to go, now." But Samuel was shaking his head, pointing to another tunnel. He made urgent gestures, trying to communicate something important. "There's more?" Eli asked. Samuel nodded and led him to a smaller chamber. This one contained something even more shocking than the money or the graves. Stacks of official documents, territorial land grants, mining claims, even what looked like territorial government correspondence. Eli's hands shook as he read through the papers. Vincent Blackwood had been blackmailing territorial officials, using his criminal network to gather information and leverage. Half the government of Arizona Territory was in his pocket. "That's why they want you dead," Eli realized. "You're not just a witness to murder. You're a witness to treason. The voices in the tunnels were getting closer now. Eli could make out at least 4 different men, and they were moving with purpose. "This way," he whispered, following Samuel toward what he hoped was another exit. But as they reached the junction of tunnels, lantern light appeared ahead of them. They were trapped. "Well, well," came Jake Brennan's voice from the darkness. "Look what we found crawling around in the dark." Eli pushed Samuel behind him and drew his gun. "Let the boy go, Brennan. This is between you and me now." Brennan stepped into the light, flanked by his 2 companions and a 4th man Eli didn't recognize, a well-dressed gentleman who looked distinctly out of place in the mine. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," the stranger said in a cultured voice. "You see, young Thomas here has seen things that could be very embarrassing to certain important people. And you are? Judge Harrison Whitmore, Territorial Court of Arizona." The man's smile was as cold as his eyes. "I'm here to ensure that certain sensitive matters remain contained." Eli felt his heart sink. A territorial judge. The corruption went all the way to the top. "Vincent Blackwood's dead, isn't he?" Eli said. "Mr. Blackwood suffered an unfortunate accident several months ago," Whitmore replied. "But his business interests live on, as do his obligations to certain parties." "You mean his blackmail material?" "Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as insurance." Samuel suddenly broke away from Eli and ran toward one of the side tunnels. Brennan raised his rifle, but Eli was faster. His Colt barked twice, and Brennan went down hard. "Kill them both!" Whitmore shouted. Gunfire erupted in the confined space, muzzle flashes lighting up the chamber like lightning. Eli dove for cover behind a pile of rocks, returning fire as best he could. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. A bullet creased his shoulder, spinning him around. Another shattered the rock beside his head. He was running out of ammunition and options. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a rumbling sound. The ground began to shake, and dust rained down from the ceiling. "What the hell?" one of Brennan's men started to say. The rumbling grew louder, and suddenly Eli understood. Samuel had found the old blasting charges that the miners had left behind. The boy was bringing down the mine. "Get out!" Eli shouted. "The whole place is coming down!" But Whitmore and his men were already running, their lanterns bobbing frantically as they fled toward the main entrance. Eli stumbled through the darkness, calling Samuel's name. He found the boy in the chamber with the graves, standing over a pile of old dynamite with a lit fuse in his hand. Samuel's eyes met Eli's, and in them, Eli saw not fear, but peace. The boy was ready to die to stop this evil from continuing. "No!" Eli lunged forward, tackling Samuel and smothering the fuse with his coat. "We're getting out of here together, son! All of us!" The rumbling was getting worse now, and cracks were appearing in the ceiling. Eli scooped Samuel up and ran for the hidden entrance they'd used earlier. Behind them, the Esperanza mine began its final collapse, burying Vincent Blackwood's secrets under tons of rock and earth. But not all of them. The ledgers in Eli's coat would be enough to bring down a corrupt network that had poisoned the territory for years. As they emerged into the desert dawn, Eli looked down at the boy in his arms. Samuel was unconscious, but breathing. They had survived, but their fight was far from over. Judge Whitmore and his men had escaped, and they would be back. But now Eli had something they wanted more than Samuel's silence. He had proof of their crimes. The game had changed, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Eli Mercer held the winning hand. 3 days had passed since the collapse of the Esperanza mine, and Tombstone was buzzing with rumors. Some said it was an earthquake. Others claimed it was the ghost of Vincent Blackwood, finally laying his demons to rest. But Eli Mercer knew the truth was far more dangerous than any ghost story. He sat in Martha's back room studying the ledgers he'd rescued from the mine, while Samuel slept fitfully on a nearby cot. The boy had barely eaten since their escape, and Eli was beginning to worry that the trauma might be too much for his young mind to bear. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Martha entered, followed by an unexpected visitor, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and travel-worn clothes. "Eli," Martha said quietly, "this is Rebecca Morrison. She's been looking for her son." Eli's heart stopped. He looked at the woman more closely and saw the resemblance immediately. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw. This was Samuel's mother. "Thomas," Rebecca whispered, moving toward the sleeping boy. "My God, what have they done to you?" Samuel's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. For a moment, he stared in confusion, then his face crumpled with emotion. He threw himself into his mother's arms, silent sobs racking his small body. "I thought you were dead," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "When Vincent took you, he said you'd never come home." "Vincent Blackwood was your brother?" Eli asked. Rebecca nodded, her face hardening. "My brother and my curse. When my husband died, Vincent offered to help with Thomas. I was desperate, alone. I didn't know what kind of monster he really was. How did you find us?" "I've been searching for over a year, following rumors, bribing officials, anything to find my son. When I heard about a cowboy who'd rescued a mute boy from the desert, I knew it had to be Thomas." Samuel pulled back from his mother and began making urgent gestures. He pointed to Eli, then to himself, then made a protective motion with his arms. "He's trying to tell you that I helped him," Eli said. "But there's more to it than that. Your son witnessed things, Rebecca. Terrible things. And there are powerful people who want him dead because of what he knows." Rebecca's face went pale. "What kind of things?" Eli showed her the ledgers, explaining what they'd found in the mine. As he spoke, Rebecca's expression shifted from horror to determination. "We have to stop them," she said firmly. "Vincent destroyed so many lives. If these records can bring his accomplices to justice—" "It's not that simple," Eli interrupted. "Judge Whitmore is involved. He has the power to make these documents disappear or claim they're forgeries. We need more than just evidence. We need a witness." Samuel had been listening intently to their conversation. Suddenly, he stood up and walked to the desk where Eli had been working. He picked up a pencil and began to write, his hand shaking with effort. The words came slowly, painfully, but they came. "I can speak." Eli and Rebecca stared in shock. "Thomas," Rebecca whispered, "your throat." Samuel touched the scar on his neck and shook his head. Then he wrote more. "Not cut deep, scared to talk. Vincent said he would kill Mama if I made sound." "You could speak this whole time?" Eli asked. Samuel nodded, then spoke aloud for the first time, his voice barely a whisper. He made me watch. Said if I ever told, he would hurt Mama. So I stayed quiet." Rebecca gathered her son in her arms again, and this time Eli could hear him crying, actual sounds of grief and relief mixed together. "It's over now," Rebecca said. "Vincent can't hurt anyone anymore. But his friends can," Eli reminded them. "Judge Whitmore won't give up easily. He has too much to lose." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the street outside. Eli moved to the window and cursed. A dozen riders were dismounting in front of the saloon, led by Judge Whitmore himself. But these weren't just hired guns. Eli recognized several territorial marshals among them. "They've made it official," he said grimly. "Whitmore's using his authority to come after us legally." "What do we do?" Rebecca asked. Before Eli could answer, Samuel stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the assembled lawmen, then turned to face Eli with a determination that was startling in someone so young. "I want to tell," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I want to tell everyone what Uncle Vincent did." "Son, it's too dangerous," Eli said. "These men will kill you before they let you testify. Then we make it so they can't," Samuel replied. "Mama, do you still have Papa's camera?" Rebecca looked confused. "Yes, but—" "We record my testimony," Samuel said, his young mind working faster than Eli could follow. "Like the newspaper men do. Then even if they kill me, the truth will still be there." Eli stared at the boy in amazement. "That's actually brilliant. But we'd need to get you to the territorial capital, to officials who aren't corrupt." "I know someone," Rebecca said suddenly. "My late husband's brother, James Morrison. He's a federal marshal in Phoenix. If we can get word to him—" Heavy footsteps on the front porch interrupted their planning. Judge Whitmore's voice boomed through the building. "This is a lawful warrant. Open up." "Back door," Martha whispered. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Eli grabbed the ledgers, while Rebecca gathered Samuel. They slipped out through Martha's kitchen just as the front door splintered under the marshal's boots. Thunder was waiting in the alley, along with a second horse that Martha had prepared. As they mounted up, Eli could hear Whitmore shouting orders inside the building. "Search every room! Find that boy!" They rode hard through Tombstone's back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Whitmore's men might spot them. Samuel clung to his mother, finally able to speak freely for the first time in over a year. "There's something else," he said as they reached the edge of town. "Uncle Vincent had a partner, someone even worse than him." "Who?" Eli asked. "A man from back east. He came to the mine sometimes. Uncle Vincent was afraid of him." "What was his name?" Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper. "Mr. Ashford. He said he owned people in Washington. Said the whole territory belonged to him." Eli felt his blood run cold. He'd heard that name before. Senator Marcus Ashford, one of the most powerful men in Congress. If Blackwood had been working for Ashford, then the corruption went all the way to the federal government. "We're not just fighting for justice," Eli realized. "We're fighting for the soul of the territory itself." As they rode toward Phoenix, Samuel continued to talk, his voice growing stronger with each mile. He told them about the children he'd seen murdered, about the government officials who'd visited the mine, about the plans he'd overheard for expanding the criminal network across the entire Southwest. By the time they reached the federal marshal's office in Phoenix, Samuel had given them enough testimony to bring down not just Judge Whitmore, but an entire conspiracy that reached from the Arizona Territory to the halls of Congress. Federal Marshal James Morrison was a man cut from different cloth than his corrupt colleagues. When he heard Samuel's story and examined the ledgers, his face went white with rage. "This is treason," he said simply, "and by God, we're going to stop it." The trial that followed made headlines across the nation. Samuel's testimony, supported by the evidence from the mine, exposed a criminal network that had been operating for years under the protection of corrupt officials. Judge Whitmore was arrested and convicted of conspiracy and murder. Senator Ashford was forced to resign in disgrace and faced federal charges. Dozens of territorial officials were removed from office, and the entire government of Arizona Territory was reorganized. But for Eli Mercer, the real victory was much simpler. On a warm evening 6 months later, he sat on the porch of Rebecca Morrison's ranch outside Phoenix, watching Samuel play with a group of local children. The boys' laughter filled the air, a sound that Eli had thought he might never hear. "You know you're welcome to stay," Rebecca said, joining Eli on the porch. "Thomas thinks of you as family now." Eli smiled but shook his head. "I'm not the settling down type. Never have been. Where will you go?" "Wherever the trail leads. There's always someone who needs help, and I reckon I'm good at providing it." Samuel ran up to the porch, his face flushed with excitement. "Eli, will you teach me to shoot before you go?" "Maybe when you're older," Eli replied. "Right now, you've got more important things to learn, like how to be a kid again." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, Eli Mercer prepared for another journey into the unknown. He'd saved one boy and helped bring down a criminal empire, but he knew there would always be more children in need, more wrongs to right. The Cowboy Loner was riding again, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns, but with courage, the courage to speak truth in the face of evil, and to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. In the distance, thunder whinnied softly, ready for whatever adventure lay ahead. And somewhere in the growing darkness, Eli Mercer smiled, knowing that he'd found his true calling at last. The boy who couldn't speak had taught the lonely cowboy how to find his voice, and in saving Samuel, Eli had finally saved himself. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.